Hey everyone, welcome back to The Weary Wanderer. Tonight, we're diving headfirst, perhaps unwisely, into the murky, crocodile-infested waters of ancient Egypt. We're here to explore exactly why life absolutely sucked for one of its most vital, yet overlooked, laborers, the ancient Egyptian Nile boatman. Gaze upon any sun-drenched temple wall, and you'll see him, the ancient Egyptian Nile boatman. He's often depicted poling gracefully through shimmering waters, a picture of stoic service as he ferries precious cargo, perhaps even a pharaoh. An idyllic scene, the lifeblood of an empire flowing smoothly. But peel back that layer of serene, painted propaganda, and the reality of being a Nile boatman was less about divine rhythm and more a daily, brutal symphony of sun, sweat, and survival. It was exhausting, dangerous, and for most who lived it, it profoundly sucked. So, as we prepare to wade into these murky waters, if you appreciate explorations of history's less glamorous realities, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And please, let us know in the comments where you're joining from. It's always fascinating to see our community of historical explorers. Now, perhaps find a comfortable spot. A true luxury our boatmen rarely if ever knew. Close your eyes for a moment, if you will, and prepare to drift down a river of hardship with us. We're about to explore the relentless toil, the hidden dangers, and the sheer, unvarnished discomfort that was the everyday existence of an ancient Egyptian Nile boatman. Forget the gilded barges. This is the story from the gritty, splintered deck. You didn't exactly choose the life of a Nile boatman, not in the way one might select a particularly appealing fig from a market stall. Choice in the sprawling, sun-baked, and rather strictly socially ordered land of Kemet was a delightful concept often reserved for those whose sandals clicked on mosaic floors, not those whose bare feet intimately knew the scorch of hot sand and the affectionate suck of river mud. For you, your path was less a decision and more a foregone conclusion, a current as reliably one-directional as the great river Hapi itself, pulling you towards a destiny steeped in its waters and liberally caked in its less fragrant sediments. You weren't so much born as you were gently deposited into the noble, perpetually damp, and impressively calloused-handed lineage of Nile boatmen. No celebratory parades marked your grand entrance, no feasts beyond, perhaps, an extra, slightly less withered onion being magnanimously shared amongst the immediate family. Your nursery wasn't exactly adorned with faience amulets or charmingly carved wooden hippos. It was more likely the cozy, ever so slightly leaky space at the stern of your father's cargo skiff, a family heirloom of dubious seaworthiness, or a hastily assembled reed lean-to on the riverbank that always carried the signature aromas of yesterday's fish, assertive mildew, and the homey perfume of a dung-fueled cooking fire. The lullabies serenading your infant dreams were the rhythmic groan of oars, a sound that would become the soundtrack to your existence. The colorful grunts of men straining against ridiculously heavy poles, the occasional distant and entirely unromantic roar of a hippo staking its territorial claim, and the endless, sibilant whisper of the river sliding past the hull, probably plotting its next bit of mischief. Your family name, assuming anyone bothered to accurately record it on a pottery shard for the local tax collector, another bundle of joy, likely translated to something suitably aspirational like "he whose back has not yet broken," or "son of he who usually smells of fish," generations before you had enthusiastically plied these waters, their lives a thrilling roller coaster dictated by the Nile's dramatic rise and fall, the pressing demands of getting the harvest somewhere before it rotted, the insatiable appetite of temple construction. Those giant stones wouldn't walk themselves, you know. Or the sudden whims of local officials needing their latest consignment of wine jars relocated with extreme prejudice. It was a legacy etched not in grand obelisks, but in the gnarled landscape of your father's hands. The permanent, sun-induced squint that gave him an air of constant suspicion, and the intricate network of worry lines around your mother's mouth, a testament to her advanced skills in mathematics, mostly calculating how to stretch one loaf of bread to feed 5. There was no Nile Navigation for Dummies papyrus. No, 7 sacred steps to becoming a barge captain who doesn't immediately sink. Your education was the river itself. Your classroom, the charmingly unstable deck. Your curriculum written in sweat, blisters, and the occasional character-building near-drowning experience. The grand social machine of Egypt, efficient as it was, had its designated cogs, and yours, lucky you, was to be one of the countless, largely interchangeable and heroically unsung men who kept the liquid lifeblood of the two lands from stagnating. You might occasionally glimpse the distant sun-bleached pylons of a temple, or the ostentatious barge of some perfumed noble decked out with more gold leaf than sense, but those were basically different planets. Your universe was the river, the boat that was probably older than your grandfather, the back-breaking load, and the ever-beckoning horizon that, with cheerful monotony, promised only more river, more boat, and more back-breaking loads. To dream of, say, becoming a professional napping champion was a dangerous luxury, a distraction from the very real possibility of the boat deciding to explore the riverbed. The Nile provided, they said. It also had a peculiar habit of consuming, and your life was pledged to its relentless, often inconvenient rhythm from your first gulp of humid air. From the moment you mastered the advanced motor skill of bipedal locomotion on a surface that pitched and yawed with the enthusiasm of a drunken sailor, your apprenticeship, a rather generous term, commenced. No parchment scrolls were signed, no guild fees paid. It was simply an unspoken, deeply ingrained expectation, as inevitable as the tax collector or a swarm of particularly determined flies. By the ripe old age of 5 or 6, you were already a highly experienced connoisseur of minor aches and major anxieties, a tiny sun-roasted figurine flitting amongst the organized chaos of the riverbank, or the even more organized chaos of a working boat. Your job description, had one existed, might have read, General Dog's Body. Responsibilities include being cheap, being expendable, fetching things that have fallen overboard, crocodiles permitting, carrying items far too heavy for your undeveloped spine, scrubbing things that will be dirty again in 5 minutes, and bailing out water from a hull that leaks with the persistence of a government rumor. Crucial skill, developing an early warning system for the swinging oar and the overseer's equally unpredictable temper. Your playthings? Ah, the delightful bounty of the river. Perhaps a suspiciously smooth river stone, a fascinating collection of beetle carapaces, some still occupied for added excitement, or a cutting-edge toy boat fashioned from a clump of papyrus, destined for a brief but glorious career before being claimed by the currents. A poignant metaphor for your own youthful aspirations. More often, your toys were just smaller, less effective versions of adult tools. A frayed piece of rope to practice knots that would one day be the only thing between a valuable cargo and an impromptu offering to Hapi. A chipped pottery shard, perfect for scooping out the ever-accumulating bilge water. A delightful cocktail of river slime, fish guts, and mystery effluvia. Or the constant, mentally stimulating game of try not to get stepped on or sworn at. Your playground was the splintered, often manure-adorned deck, a thrilling obstacle course of shifting sacks, tethered livestock with questionable hygiene standards, and even more questionable tempers, and coils of coarse rope seemingly animated by a malevolent desire to trip the unwary. Or, for a change of scenery, the bustling aromatic riverbank, a full sensory assault of bellowing merchants, philosophically braying donkeys, the rhythmic thwack of wet clay in the potter's compound, and the rich, complex bouquet of aromas that only a thriving riverside settlement can produce. Life, death, commerce, and a whole lot of things you tried not to identify too closely. While the offspring of scribes were diligently mastering the beautiful, if slightly overcomplicated, art of hieroglyphs on their little wooden writing boards, or the sons of priests were memorizing chants that probably promised a much nicer afterlife than you were currently enduring. Your education was of a more practical, hands-on, and often feed-in variety. You were becoming fluent in the subtle, often treacherous language of the river, the almost invisible dimple on the water's surface that screamed, "Hidden sandbank, you moron." Zrenia. the subtle change in the wind's mournful tune that hinted at an approaching squall ready to ruin your day. The very specific, pungent aroma that kindly announced a large crocodile was currently enjoying a bit of sunbathing in the reeds, probably dreaming of small, tender boat boys. You learned how to coil a rope so it wouldn't transform into an Gordian knot at the precise moment of crisis, how to leverage your insignificant body weight to assist in shifting a cargo sack that seemed to weigh more than a small obelisk, and how to accurately gauge the mood of the river with the same cautious respect you'd afford a particularly short-tempered baboon armed with a stick. Recreational activities were, shall we say, uniquely tailored to your environment. Dodge the unexpectedly swinging cargo boom was a daily test of agility and precognition. Retrieve the master's favorite lading pin from 3 feet of opaque, probably leech-infested water, built character and lung capacity. How long until father's vein stops throbbing? Because the tow rope has snagged on an invisible submerged tree stump again. Was less a game and more a high-stakes psychological drama. You quickly mapped out the boat's microclimates. The tiny patch of deck that offered a nanometer of shade during the midday solar assault, and which dark corners were popular scorpion timeshares. You learned that expressing distress over a fresh splinter or a festering rope burn would earn you at best a look of profound disinterest, and at worst, a helpful suggestion to stop your blubbering before you attract the crocodiles. Pain, you see, wasn't just a sensation. It was an educational tool, a constant, highly effective instructor. The river, that generous provider, was a demanding, entirely unsentimental taskmaster, and she initiated her curriculum early, ensuring you were under no illusions about your exalted place in her grand, frequently damp scheme. Your childhood wasn't so much stolen as it was pragmatically repurposed, hammered and beaten into a shape that could, with a bit of luck, withstand the ongoing tender mercies of the Nile. Your guide through this sun-drenched, waterlogged obstacle course of a youth was, most likely, your own father, or perhaps a conveniently available uncle or an older brother whose youthful optimism had already been effectively scoured away by the river's abrasive charm. He wasn't so much a patient instructor in the Socratic method as he was a permanent, slightly menacing feature of the landscape you had to learn to navigate, like a particularly tricky cataract. His face was a masterpiece of solar artwork and windburn, a leathery canvas etched with the fine lines of 1,000 glaring dawns, and the deeper trenches of unending fatigue and low-grade anxiety. His hands were gnarled, powerful tools, a living archive of past encounters with rough ropes, splintered wood, and the occasional uncooperative fish. They understood the language of an oar, a pole, a tow rope, with a fluency that far surpassed their ability to convey, say, paternal affection. His teaching style was a masterclass in brutal efficiency. Words were a precious commodity, to be deployed with the same reluctance one might show in parting with their last waterskin on a desert trek. His extensive vocabulary largely consisted of monosyllabic grunts, expressive eyebrow raises that could convey a surprising range of disapproval, and the occasional concisely barked command, "Pull, curse you. Hold, or we're all fish food. Bank now, before that noble's pleasure barge runs us down. You boy, tie that off properly unless you want to see what a ton of pottery looks like on the riverbed." Explanations were a rare and exotic treat, like finding a fig that wasn't full of ants. You learned by observing his weary, yet surprisingly precise movements, the way he seemed to smell a shift in the current before it happened, the almost imperceptible adjustment of his stance to counter the boat's lurch, the uncanny skill with which he could spit a stream of beetle nut juice to precisely mark a point on the distant riverbank, a skill far more useful than advanced geometry, frankly. Mistakes were not viewed as learning opportunities. Oh no. They were invitations for a colorful critique, a glare that could curdle milk from 50 paces, or a swift, attention-grabbing smack to the back of the head, delivered less from genuine malice, one hoped, and more from the deeply ingrained frustration of a life spent wrestling a capricious environment with tools that were probably last state-of-the-art during the reign of some long-forgotten scorpion king. Any perceived kindness was a rare and subtle creature, glimpsed fleetingly like a kingfisher. It might appear as an almost invisible twitch of the lips that could generously be interpreted as a smile. when you finally managed to secure a complex mooring knot without fumbling for 10 minutes. Or perhaps the grunted offering of the slightly less burnt end of his own coarse bread after a day spent hauling the barge through shallows, so thick with mud it felt like you were dragging it through week-old porridge. More commonly, his version of pastoral care was delivered through blunt, pragmatic warnings. Don't dangle your feet in the water, you brainless oaf, unless you fancy becoming a crocodile's toothpick. Or, keep your wits about you, boy. The duat is probably full of fools who didn't watch where they were stepping. He wasn't meticulously training you in a respected craft. He was callously conditioning you for survival. He was, after all, a product of the same relentless, unforgiving system. He knew, with a bone-deep certainty that brooked no argument, that the river did not offer sick days or second chances, and therefore neither could he if his progeny were to entertain even a slim hope of reaching an age where their back permanently ached. He was your mentor, your tormentor, and a walking, groaning advertisement for the joyous life that stretched before you, an endless vista of hard labor under a sky that mostly just offered more heat. If you were to ask our Nile boatman for a detailed itinerary of his average week, he'd probably just stare at you with the blank, uncomprehending gaze of someone who measures time not in neat, scribal demarcations of days and hours, but in aching muscles, empty bellies, and the ever-shifting distance to the next soul-crushingly identical landmark on the riverbank. Variety, for him, was mostly about whether the wind was trying to actively murder him from the north, or merely conspire with the current to strand him on a sandbank populated exclusively by belligerent geese. Holidays? Paid time off? The concept of a weekend? These were delightful fantasies, perhaps discussed in hushed, envious tones by the scribes tallying the grain you were hauling. But for the boatman, they were as mythical as a benevolent hippopotamus. The river god Hapi, in his infinite muddy wisdom, did not observe holy days when it came to currents, nor did the tax grain spontaneously transport itself to the pharaoh's granaries. Thus your calendar was a simple, brutal binary. Either you were working, or you were briefly unconscious in a state resembling sleep, preparing to work again. A typical day, if such a word can be applied to a life that often felt like one long, unbroken stretch of misery, began well before Ra, the sun god, even bothered to yawn and consider dragging his solar bark across the sky. It started with a jolt, perhaps a kick from an overseer's sandal, or the ingrained alarm clock of anticipated suffering in the pre-dawn chill that clung to the river. Your luxurious breakfast was likely a hunk of coarse barley bread, dense enough to ballast a small skiff and tasting remarkably like compacted sawdust, washed down with a gulp of tepid water scooped directly from the Nile. A beverage that often carried more life within it, parasitically speaking, than you felt in your entire weary body. Then, it was straight to the office. If heading upstream, south, against the Nile's relentless current, this meant the oars. These weren't the finely balanced, lightweight implements of some noble's pleasure craft. Oh no. These were monstrous, heavy beams of rough-hewn wood, splinter-prone and awkwardly weighted. Settling onto your designated thwart, a plank polished smooth by generations of other unfortunate posteriors, you'd wedge your bare feet against the stretcher, grip the oar that felt like a tree trunk, and prepare for hours of mind-numbing, muscle-screaming, blister-popping labor. The rhythm was dictated by a chanter, if you were lucky, or more often by the overseer's encouraging bellows and the persuasive crack of his motivational stick. Pull, feather, recover, pull. Each stroke was a fresh argument with the river, a tiny, exhausting victory, or a weary stalemate. Your back would seize, your shoulders would burn, the skin on your palms would shred and reshred, forming calluses that were themselves prone to cracking and bleeding. If the wind was favorable, a rare and suspicious occurrence, usually meaning a sandstorm was imminent, or if you were heading downstream, you might enjoy a period of sailing. This involved wrestling with a clumsy square sail made of heavy linen or papyrus matting, hauling on thick, abrasive ropes of palm fiber or flax, and trying to keep the damn thing from either collapsing in a useless heap or catching a gust that threatened to send your rickety vessel on an unplanned detour into the papyrus swamps, the favored haunt of things with large teeth and short tempers. And even with a sail, steering with the massive, unwieldy stern-mounted rudder oar was a full-body workout, requiring constant vigilance and brute strength to keep the boat on course, especially if it was laden with several tons of someone else's very important property. When both wind and current were feeling particularly uncooperative, or when navigating narrow, shallow channels, it was time for the poles or the tow ropes. Poling involved thrusting long, heavy wooden poles into the riverbed and pushing, a task that engaged every muscle you didn't even know you possessed, particularly those in your gut and upper arms, all while trying not to slip on the wet deck and impale yourself or a colleague. Towing, however, was a special circle of hell. This involved you and your fellow sufferers being unceremoniously dumped on the riverbank, slinging thick, coarse ropes over your shoulders, and literally dragging the boat, inch by painful inch, against the river's might. You became a beast of burden, stumbling over rocks, sinking into mud, lashed by thorns from acacia bushes, all under the same relentless sun, with the overseer ambling alongside, helpfully pointing out that you weren't pulling hard enough. Breaks were a charming fiction. Lunch might be a few dried dates and another lump of that delightful bread, eaten while still at your oar or leaning on your pole, with one eye on the taskmaster. A moment to relieve oneself was usually over the side, a quick and public affair that added its own unique contribution to the river's rich ecosystem. The work only truly ceased when the light failed, or when the overseer finally decided his own throat was too hoarse from shouting to continue. Then, it was a matter of mooring the boat, often a complex and dangerous task in itself, especially in unfamiliar territory or crowded quays. Perhaps a meager evening meal, more bread, maybe a scrap of dried fish if the cargo wasn't too valuable, meaning less guards and thus more opportunity for minor pilfering, a high-risk sport. And then, collapse onto whatever hard, damp surface passed for your bed, your body a symphony of aches, your mind too numb for dreams, knowing that in a few short hours, the whole glorious cycle would begin anew. This wasn't a job, it was a sentence. The ancient Egyptians, in their wisdom, deified many aspects of their environment, and one can only assume this was a polite attempt to appease forces that were, on a daily basis, actively trying to make life miserable for the average boatman. The Nile, the great god Hapi, giver of life, sustainer of the two lands. For you, Hapi was less a benevolent provider and more a bipolar, muddy overlord with a serious attitude problem. One day, he might grant you a relatively smooth passage, his currents purring like a contented cat. The next, for no discernible reason, he'd be a raging, debris-choked torrent. Or he'd playfully hide new sandbanks just beneath the surface, waiting with gleeful anticipation for your hull to scrape aground with a sickening crunch, prompting a fresh round of curses from the captain and renewed activity from the overseer's stick. His waters, so vital for the crops, were for you a constant source of toil, to be rowed against, poled through, or occasionally involuntarily submerged in. And let's not forget his charming residents, the crocodiles who watched you with the patient, hungry eyes of a tax collector sizing up a peasant, and the hippos who treated your boat as a personal inconvenience to be violently nudged or overturned at whim. Then there was Ra, the mighty sun god, sailing his celestial bark across the heavens. From your vantage point on a treeless river under a cloudless sky, Ra often felt less like a bringer of light and more like a cosmic interrogator with a giant heat lamp. His daily journey was your daily torment. From the moment he cleared the eastern horizon, he began his relentless assault, baking the deck until it was hot enough to fry fish, if you had any fish and if you weren't too busy working to fry it. He beat down on your exposed head, neck, and shoulders, raising blisters on top of old burns, leaching the moisture from your body, and cooking your brain inside your skull until coherent thought was a distant memory. The only relief was his eventual, grudging descent into the western Duat, and even then, the heat radiating from the parched earth and the boat itself lingered for hours. Shade was a mythical paradise, a tale told by travelers from distant imaginary lands. And the wind. Oh, the desert wind, the breath of Set, Lord of Chaos. It wasn't the gentle, cooling zephyr you might read about in poetic inscriptions. No, this was either a hot, suffocating blanket that made every breath an effort, or a sand-blasting fury that whipped up the desert and flung it into your face with malicious accuracy. It filled your eyes with grit, your nostrils with dust, your mouth with the taste of the red land. It turned your meager food rations into a crunchy surprise. When it blew from the wrong direction, it was your sworn enemy, a stubborn, invisible wall against which you pitted your aching muscles for hours, making zero progress and maximum misery. When it blew too hard, it threatened to rip your sail to shreds or capsize your unwieldy craft. The wind, like most things in your life, was rarely your friend. Even the landscape itself seemed to conspire against you. The riverbanks were either sheer, crumbling cliffs where mooring was impossible, or tangled, thorny thickets of acacia and tamarisk that snagged tow ropes and tore at your skin and clothing. The shallows were either gluey mud that sucked at your poles and your feet, or beds of sharp reeds that could inflict nasty cuts. And always, there was the vast, indifferent desert stretching away on either side, a constant reminder of the precariousness of your watery existence, a silent, sandy threat that if you failed here, on the river, there was nowhere else to go but into its desiccated, deadly embrace. Every league of the river presented a new set of challenges, a fresh environmental insult, a reminder that you were a tiny, insignificant speck toiling in a world that was, at best, completely indifferent to your survival, and at worst, actively trying to erase you. To say the life of a Nile boatman was an assault on the senses is an understatement akin to calling a crocodile a bit toothy. It was a full frontal, no-holds-barred invasion, a constant barrage of stimuli almost exclusively designed to cause discomfort, annoyance, or outright disgust. Your world was a cacophony, a never-ending soundtrack to your toil. Forget the gentle lapping of water or the tranquil songs of birds often depicted in tomb reliefs. Your auditory reality began with the rhythmic, soul-destroying creak-groan thump of the massive oars in their poorly lubricated wooden locks, a sound that drilled its way into your skull and echoed in your phantom limbs even during your brief snatches of sleep. This was overlaid by the incessant, high-pitched whine of mosquitoes, a herald of itchy doom, especially prevalent at dawn and dusk, when the air was still. Add to this the sharp, sudden crack of the overseer's whip, a sound that made every muscle flinch, whether it was aimed at your back or that of the poor soul next to you. Then there were the human sounds, the grunts and strained coughs of your fellow rowers, the hoarse, repetitive shouts of the foreman, "Heave! Ho! Put your miserable backs into it, you sluggards!" The haggling cries from other boats or the riverbank, and your own ragged breathing as you fought for every gasp of superheated air. If you were lucky enough to be transporting livestock, you had the added delight of their contributions, the mournful braying of donkeys, who clearly shared your opinion of this whole endeavor, the frantic bleating of sheep, convinced they were heading to a much worse fate than yours. They were probably right. Or the indignant squawking of crated geese. And beneath it all, the endless monotonous slap-slap hiss of water against the hull, a sound that was sometimes a lullaby of tedium, sometimes a mocking reminder of the river's relentless power. Silence was a forgotten country, a peace you could no longer imagine. Your skin was a battleground. From dawn till dusk, the sun waged war, leaving it perpetually burnt, peeling, or baked into a leathery toughness that still somehow managed to feel raw. Sweat was a constant companion. It drenched your meager loincloth, stung your eyes, and mixed with the ever-present river grime and dust to form a delightful abrasive paste that chafed every moving part of your body. Your hands were a testament to your trade, calloused to the point of being woody, yet crisscrossed with fresh blisters from the oars or poles, and deep, painful cracks from the constant wetting and drying. Rope burns were a common decoration, angry red welts that throbbed with every movement. Insect bites weren't occasional annoyances. They were a permanent state of being. Mosquitoes, sandflies, horseflies, and nameless other multi-legged fiends feasted upon you with impunity, leaving behind itchy, swollen bumps that you'd scratch raw in your sleep, leading to scabs and potential infections. The gritty kiss of wind-blown sand was everywhere. In your eyes, making them red-rimmed and sore. In your ears, up your nose, and most unpleasantly, between your teeth, giving every mouthful of food an unexpected crunch. The boat itself was a haven of discomfort. The wood was splintered, waiting to embed itself in your bare feet or backside. Any surface you leaned against was either baking hot, surprisingly damp and mildewed, or coated in something sticky and unidentifiable. If you were rowing, the rough thwart rubbed your rear end raw. If you were poling, the strain on your shoulders and abdomen was a constant deep ache. Thirst was a perpetual torment, a dry, rasping feeling in your throat that the often brackish or silt-laden river water never truly quenched, only temporarily subdued, while introducing new microbial friends to your intestines. Hunger was a dull, persistent ache in your belly, a reminder that the mountain of grain you were transporting was not for you. If you thought the sounds and sensations were bad, the smells would like a word. Your personal fragrance, after a day's or week's labor, without the luxury of, say, bathing, was a potent brew of stale sweat, sun-baked grime, and a faint, underlying note of desperation. This, however, was merely the base layer of the rich olfactory tapestry that was life on a Nile barge. The bilge water, that delightful cocktail sloshing in the bottom of the boat, contributed a complex bouquet of stagnant river water, rotting wood, decomposing fish scales, forgotten scraps of food, and probably the mummified remains of several generations of unfortunate rats. It was a smell that had body, character, and the ability to make your eyes water from 10 paces. Then there was the cargo. If it was livestock, you enjoyed the rich, earthy aromas of animal dung and urine, baking in the sun, often enhanced by the panicked excretions of beasts deeply unhappy with their mode of transport. If it was dried fish, the pungent, oily stink would permeate everything, clinging to your clothes and hair for weeks. Even something as seemingly innocuous as grain, when stored in bulk in warm, damp conditions, could develop a musty, slightly sour odor that was less than appetizing. Add to this the smell of wood smoke from countless cooking fires on other boats or along the banks, the scent of rotting vegetation from the papyrus swamps, the occasional deeply unsettling sweetness of a decaying animal carcass caught in the reeds, and the ever-present, slightly metallic tang of the Nile mud itself. Fresh air was a concept so alien it might as well have been a myth from a distant land. You breathed in a miasma, a soup of smells so potent it could probably deter a determined locust swarm. The rich and powerful might perfume themselves with lotus and myrrh. Your signature scent was eau de Nil misery, a fragrance guaranteed to ensure you always had plenty of personal space, whether you wanted it or not. If a craftsman is only as good as his tools, then our ancient Egyptian Nile boatman was, by default, hovering somewhere between barely competent and an active menace to navigation, through no real fault of his own. The tools of his trade were less precision instruments, and more a collection of obstinate, poorly designed, and frequently malevolent objects that seemed to view his attempts to earn a meager existence as a personal affront. They were not so much aids to labor as they were active participants in the daily drama of his suffering, often taking starring roles in the everything goes horribly wrong segment of the program. Let's begin with your primary workplace and occasional unwilling submarine, the boat. Whether you were gracing the deck of a broad-beamed cargo barge designed to haul anything from enormous blocks of Aswan granite each weighing more than your entire village and its collective livestock, to delicate and eminently breakable wine amphorae, or you were crammed onto a smaller, nimbler skiff used for lighter duties or navigating treacherous shallows. One thing was usually consistent. It was probably trying to sink. If it was an older wooden boat, its timbers of acacia or sycamore fig, woods chosen more for local availability than for their stellar nautical properties, were likely warped by the relentless sun, cracked by the dry desert air, and softened by constant immersion. The caulking, a delightful mixture of Nile mud, reeds, and perhaps a dash of wishful thinking, had a charming habit of drying out and crumbling away, inviting the river to come on in for a visit. This meant that bailing the bilge wasn't an occasional chore. It was a permanent, rotating position on the duty roster, a Sisyphean task of ejecting water that was seeping back in with the cheerful persistence of a determined tax collector. Every ominous creak from the hull as it flexed under a heavy load or battled a choppy current wasn't just the boat settling. It was the boat actively considering early retirement at the bottom of the Nile. You learned to sleep with one ear open for the telltale gurgle that signaled a new leak had sprung, ready to leap into action with a bundle of reeds and a prayer to whatever minor deity oversaw shoddy boat construction. If your vessel was of the more ancient papyrus reed variety, bundles of reeds lashed together with impressive, if ultimately futile, ingenuity, you had a different set of anxieties. While wonderfully buoyant initially, these reed boats had a tendency to become waterlogged over time, gradually riding lower and lower in the water, until you felt less like a boatman and more like a particularly damp amphibian. They were also remarkably susceptible to damage from sharp rocks, inquisitive crocodiles with a taste for fibrous snacks, or simply the wear and tear of being dragged over sandbanks. Repairing one often involved frantically trying to lash new bundles of reeds into place while half submerged and trying to ignore the nibbling sensations around your ankles. Those magnificent oars, the primary means by which you propelled your floating burden against the river's stubborn will, were masterpieces of inconvenience. Fashioned from hefty branches or roughly shaped planks, they were heavy, unbalanced, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to develop new splinters in precisely the spot where your palm was already a bloody mess. The wood, often unseasoned, would warp and crack. The oar blade, if not properly secured, could twist annoyingly at every stroke, or worse, detach itself entirely and float away with a mocking little bob, leaving you to explain its absence to the overseer, a conversation rarely ending well, and the satisfying snap of an oar breaking mid-stroke, usually when you were exerting maximum effort to avoid collision with another, larger, and far more important-looking boat. That was a sound that signaled not just the loss of an essential tool, but also the imminent arrival of chaos, shouting, and probably a painful impact of some sort, either with the other boat or with the overseer's disciplinary implement. You'd then have the joy of trying to control a heavy, drifting barge with one less oar, a task akin to trying to steer a drunken hippopotamus with a feather. For navigating shallows or pushing off from sticky mudbanks, you had the pole. A long, thick shaft of wood, ideally straight, but more often possessing a quirky bend that made it unpredictable. The main trick with a pole was to push hard enough to move the boat, but not so hard that the pole became irretrievably stuck in the glutinous Nile mud. Extracting a stuck pole was a sweaty, cursing affair, often involving several men and a great deal of undignified floundering. Sometimes the pole would win, remaining defiantly embedded as the boat drifted away, leaving you to face the music. Other times, it would suddenly release, sending you staggering backward into your colleagues or, for added excitement, overboard. And of course, a poorly handled pole, especially in a crowded boat, was an excellent tool for accidentally jabbing someone in the ribs or eye, leading to yet more onboard camaraderie. Ropes, woven from palm fibers, flax, or papyrus, were the sinews of your operation, used for towing, mooring, securing cargo, and hoisting the sail. They were also, universally, treacherous. Under the relentless Egyptian sun, they dried out and became brittle. Soaked by river water, They became heavy and prone to rot. They would fray with an almost gleeful enthusiasm, individual strands parting company, until the whole rope was a shadow of its former self, just waiting for that one critical moment of strain to give up the ghost entirely. A snapping tow rope was a particularly spectacular failure. One moment you and your team are straining like oxen, dragging tons of boat and cargo against the current. The next, a sound like a giant snapping his fingers, and you're all pitched forward onto your faces in the dust or mud, while the boat begins a merry journey back downstream. Mooring ropes would chafe on rough keystones, parting silently in the night to send your vessel on an impromptu solo voyage. Cargo lashings would loosen, allowing precious amphorae to joyfully smash against each other with every lurch of the boat. You learned to inspect ropes with a paranoid diligence, but even then, they'd find new and inventive ways to betray your trust. Ah, the sail. That magnificent square of woven linen or papyrus matting, your supposed ally against the relentless current when the wind deigned to blow from a useful direction, which it rarely did with any consistency. Raising it was a hernia-inducing group effort, hauling on stiff, abrasive halyards. Once up, it was a constant source of anxiety. Too little wind, and it would flap with a sad, dispirited sound, a useless linen handkerchief on a very large stick. Too much wind, or a sudden gust from an unexpected quarter, and it would strain and groan, threatening to rip the mast out by its roots, tear itself into expensive ribbons, or, in a worst-case scenario, act as a giant scoop to capsize your entire enterprise. Trimming the sail to the fickle desert winds, with the primitive rigging available, was less a science and more a form of desperate gambling. The ropes controlling it would jam in their blocks. The sail itself would develop mysterious bulges and pockets of air that did nothing for your speed but everything for your stress levels. And if it did tear, mending it, especially in anything other than a dead calm, was a nightmare of flapping canvas, tangled twine, and curses that would make a hardened soldier blush. When it came to personal protective equipment, the ancient Egyptian Nile boatman was a minimalist, though not by choice. His entire wardrobe, and indeed his armor against the myriad dangers of his profession, usually consisted of a fetching little number, typically a rectangle of coarse linen wrapped around the hips and secured with a knot or a fold. Its primary functions were to preserve a bare minimum of public decency, a standard that varied wildly, and to provide a convenient surface upon which sweat and grime could accumulate. As protection against the sun? Laughable. It left vast expanses of skin exposed to Ra's fiercest attentions. Against splinters from the boat's timbers? It was more likely to snag on them. Against the enthusiastic bites of 1,000 flies, mosquitoes, and other airborne denizens of the Nile? It was an open invitation to a feast. In cold weather, yes, desert nights on the river could be surprisingly frigid. It offered the thermal protection of a single damp leaf. If you were lucky, you might have a strip of linen to tie around your head. This sophisticated piece of technology primarily served to absorb sweat and channel it directly into your eyes with remarkable efficiency. It offered minimal shade and certainly no impact protection. Some representations show boatmen with wider-brimmed papyrus hats, but for the common laborer, such finery was unlikely. More often, your protection from the overhead sun was your own matted hair and a rapidly developing layer of sun-baked scalp. Sandals were for scribes, priests, and nobles. Your feet were bare, toughened by a lifetime of contact with hot sand, sharp stones, splintered wood, Nile mud, and whatever else happened to be underfoot. This meant cuts, bruises, thorns, and the constant risk of stepping on something unpleasant, be it a scorpion, a discarded fish hook, or a particularly sharp piece of broken pottery. On board, shelter was a generous term for crouching under a thwart during a brief rain shower, or trying to find a sliver of shade cast by the sail, or a stack of cargo during the midday inferno. At night, If you weren't sleeping ashore in a crude reed hut that offered minimal protection from wind, dew, or inquisitive wildlife, you were curled up on the hard deck, exposed to the elements and the aforementioned insect life. Essentially, your protection was your own rapidly toughening hide, and a good deal of hope that nothing too sharp, too hot, too cold, or too venomous would make direct contact. It was a system that relied heavily on luck, and luck, as any boatman knew, was a commodity in even shorter supply than good rope. And so, you existed in a state of unholy matrimony with these treacherous tools. You depended on them utterly. Without the boat, leaky as it was, there was no livelihood. Without the oars, however splintered, you were at the mercy of the current. Without the ropes, however frayed, cargo would be lost and lives endangered. This absolute dependence bred a deep, simmering resentment. Every snapped oar, every parted rope, every new leak was a personal insult, a fresh betrayal by an inanimate object that seemed to possess a stubborn, malevolent will of its own. You'd curse them under your breath, and sometimes out loud, if the overseer was out of earshot or sufficiently distracted by his own discomfort. You'd kick a stubbornly wedged pole with a satisfying, if ultimately futile, thud. You'd glare at a frayed rope as if daring it to snap, yet in the brief moments between toiling and collapsing you tended to them. You had to. Your life and the meager rations that sustained it depended on keeping this collection of barely functional junk operational, so you'd sit in the brief evening cool, painstakingly re-whipping the end of a rope with a precious strand of new fiber, trying to prevent its complete unraveling. You'd use a piece of rough sandstone, your only file, to try and smooth down the newest crop of splinters on an oar handle, knowing more would appear by noon the next day. You'd meticulously patch a tear in the sail, with a sharpened fishbone for a needle and whatever thread you could scrounge, a task made delightful by the sail's unwieldy size and the poor light. You'd assist in smearing fresh Nile mud and chopped reeds into the boat's seams, a temporary fix that would buy you a few more days, perhaps, before the river found a new way in. This wasn't loving care. It was desperate maintenance, a constant, weary battle against entropy and shoddy craftsmanship. Each repair was a small act of defiance, a refusal to be entirely beaten by the sheer, stubborn awfulness of your equipment. You didn't trust your tools. You didn't particularly like them. But they were your awful tools, your partners in this daily dance of misery, and in a strange, twisted way, they were all that stood between you and an even worse fate, perhaps becoming a mud brick maker, or worse, unemployed and starving. It was a bond forged in shared hardship, mutual unreliability, and the constant unspoken understanding that at any given moment, one of you was probably going to let the other down, most likely with painful consequences. If our boatman's tools were in a perpetual state of rebellion, his own body was staging a full-blown insurrection, a mutiny against the relentless abuse it was forced to endure. And his mind? Well, his mind was clinging on by its metaphorical fingernails, peering over the precipice of numb despair, occasionally waving a tiny sarcastic flag of defiance. The price for keeping Egypt's lifeblood flowing wasn't just paid in sweat and blisters, it was paid in ground-down joints, ravaged organs, and a spirit slowly eroded by the endless, churning river of drudgery. By the time he'd seen enough inundations to count on more than one hand, assuming he still had all his fingers, our boatman's physique was less a temple of human vitality and more a dilapidated, condemned shrine, haunted by the ghosts of departed cartilage and the shrieking demons of chronic pain. His back, once straight enough in his youth, likely began to resemble the serpentine course of a minor Nile tributary, or perhaps a poorly drawn hieroglyph for suffering. Years of rowing with uneven, heavy oars, hauling on tow ropes with a twisting motion, and lifting cargo far exceeding any sensible weight limit would conspire to misalign vertebrae, pinch nerves with gleeful abandon, and generally transform his spinal column into an instrument of torture. Scoliosis wasn't a diagnosis. It was an occupational hazard. Each morning, straightening up from his reed mat, if he was lucky enough to have one, would be accompanied by a symphony of cracks, pops, and groans that could rival the sound of a cargo net giving way. Chronic, burning lower back pain was his constant shadow, a dull ache that sharpened into dagger-like thrusts with any sudden movement or prolonged effort. His knees, shoulders, hips, and elbows, those marvels of articulation, were systematically ground down like soft sandstone under a relentless millstone. Rowing, poling, lifting, hauling, every primary activity was a direct assault on these crucial junctions. Arthritis, the unwelcome guest, would move in early, setting up permanent residence and inviting all its inflammatory friends. His shoulders would scream in protest, with every oar stroke, the cartilage worn thin, bone grating on bone. His knees, subjected to endless strain and awkward postures, would swell and ache, making even the simple act of squatting to tend a mooring rope a trial. His hips would burn from the repetitive stress, and even his fingers, gnarled from gripping oars and ropes in all weathers, would become stiff, swollen, and permanently curled, resembling arthritic bird claws. The graceful fluidity of youth was a distant, almost insulting memory. Lifting impossibly heavy sacks of grain, unwieldy pottery jars, or stubborn blocks of stone, often with poor leverage and no concept of safe lifting techniques, a notion as alien as a comfortable retirement plan, meant that hernias were practically a rite of passage. A sudden searing pain in the groin or abdomen, followed by the appearance of an unwelcome bulge, was a common boatman's lament. With no surgical recourse beyond hoping it might somehow pop back in, it rarely did. Obligingly, he'd continue to work, the hernia, a throbbing, agonizing reminder of his body's limits being brutally and repeatedly ignored. His hands, as previously noted, were less human appendages and more like gnarled, wooden implements. Beyond the landscape of calluses, blisters, and missing nails, the constant exposure to wet ropes, river water, and filth made them prone to stubborn fungal infections that turned the skin between his fingers into a raw, itchy, weeping mess. Infections from splinters or cuts were a constant threat, sometimes leading to spectacular swellings, fevers, and if Osiris was feeling particularly uncharitable, the loss of a finger to gangrene. His feet, those unsung heroes, fared no better. Perpetually bare, they were trodden upon, scraped, punctured, and stewed. The arches would flatten under years of bearing weight on uneven surfaces. Toenails, like their finger counterparts, were often blackened, thickened, or simply gone. The skin, cracked like drought-stricken earth, invited infections. Walking on a deck sizzling under the midday sun was a form of daily torture, and the cool relief of river mud often came with the unwelcome bonus of burrowing parasites or sharp hidden debris. His skin, where not actively infected or peeling from sunburn, would take on the texture of poorly tanned leather, tough, dry, and deeply grooved. Chronic exposure to sun, wind, and abrasive Nile water did little for its youthful elasticity. Rashes, heat boils, and mysterious itchy patches were common, exacerbated by filth and sweat. Any minor cut or abrasion, instead of healing cleanly, would often fester, surrounded by an angry red halo, another small battle for his already overburdened immune system. Staring into the relentless glare of the sun reflecting off the water for 12 hours a day, year after year, was a recipe for ocular disaster. Pterygium, a fleshy growth on the white of the eye, would gradually creep across the cornea, impairing vision. Cataracts, clouding the lens, would develop far earlier than in those who spent their lives in shadier pursuits. Chronic eye infections, thanks to wind-blown sand, dust, the ever-present flies buzzing around his face and wiping sweat away with filthy hands, were a constant, gritty irritation, leaving his eyes red-rimmed, itchy, and perpetually watering. His vision, so crucial for navigating and spotting hazards, would slowly, inexorably fade. Our boatman's dental plan was, shall we say, rudimentary. His diet, heavy on coarse, stone-ground grains, meant a constant intake of abrasive grit that wore down tooth enamel with alarming efficiency. Access to anything resembling dental hygiene was non-existent. Broken teeth, abscesses, and rampant decay were the norm. The throbbing agony of an infected tooth, far from any dentist, a profession probably involving pliers and a strong assistant, was just another torment to be endured, perhaps temporarily dulled by chewing on a willow twig, if he knew the trick and could find one. The visible wear and tear was only half the story. Internally, our boatman was fighting a constant war against a host of invisible enemies, invited in by his environment and lifestyle. This was the quintessential boatman's affliction, the Nile's special gift. Tiny parasitic flatworms, living in freshwater snails, would release their larvae into the water. Every time our boatman waded into the shallows to push the boat, haul a net, or answer nature's call, these microscopic invaders would burrow painlessly through his skin. Once inside, they'd mature in his blood vessels, particularly around the bladder and intestines, laying thousands of eggs. The body's reaction to these eggs caused inflammation and gradual damage to organs. Symptoms were insidious. Fatigue, as if he needed more of that. Abdominal pain, blood in the urine, a disturbingly common sight, often just accepted as normal, and eventually, severe liver and bladder damage. It was a slow, debilitating disease that drained his strength and shortened his life, a permanent internal passenger picked up from the very river that defined his existence. Drinking contaminated Nile water, eating food prepared with unwashed hands or visited by flies, was a daily gamble with his digestive system. Dysentery, with its delightful combination of severe diarrhea, abdominal cramps, and fever, was a frequent and debilitating companion. It would leave him perilously dehydrated, weak as a newborn kitten, and in a state of profound misery, still expected to perform hard labor. Other waterborne bacteria and amoebas also lay in wait, ready to turn his insides into a churning, gurgling war zone. The marshes and reed beds along the Nile were breeding grounds for vast armies of mosquitoes. Many of these carried the malaria parasite. The cycles of intense fever, bone-rattling chills, and drenching sweats would incapacitate him for days, leaving him even weaker and more vulnerable. Other fevers, from unidentified infections picked up from cuts, insect bites, or spoiled food, would also lay him low, his body burning as it fought unseen battles. With no understanding of germ theory, these were often attributed to malevolent spirits or the displeasure of some minor god. Small comfort when you felt like your blood was boiling. While not as acute as some other ailments, his lungs also suffered. Constant exposure to dust from the desert, smoke from bankside fires or onboard cooking braziers, and potentially mold spores from damp reeds or decaying cargo would take its toll. A persistent cough, shortness of breath, and a susceptibility to lung infections were likely companions, especially as he aged. The sheer caloric output of his daily labor far outstripped the meager, often poor quality rations he received. His body was in a perpetual state of nutritional deficit. This didn't just mean hunger pangs. It meant muscle wasting, a compromised immune system, and a lack of essential vitamins and minerals that could lead to a host of issues. Night blindness from lack of vitamin A, skin problems, slow wound healing, and a general inability to recover from exertion or illness. Dehydration was a constant threat under the brutal sun. While he drank from the river, the water was often lost as quickly through sweat, and its quality did more harm than good in the long run. Beyond specific illnesses, there was the profound, bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion that became his baseline state of being. It was more than just being tired after a hard day. It was a weariness that settled into his marrow, a leaden weight that no amount of sleep, which was always insufficient and poor quality anyway, could truly dispel. Every limb felt heavy, every task an immense effort, This chronic fatigue magnified every other ache, pain, and misery, making the world a duller, more threatening place. The relentless physical assault was mirrored by an equally brutal, though often invisible, erosion of his mental and emotional well-being. The mind, like the body, can only endure so much. Life was a tightrope walk over a pit of crocodiles, both literal and metaphorical. There was the immediate, visceral fear, the sudden lurch of the boat signaling a submerged obstacle or an aggressive hippo, the chilling slither of a snake on the deck, the terrifying crack of a breaking oar in a strong current, the sight of a fellow boatman swept overboard. Then there was the chronic, low-level anxiety. Would the cargo shift and capsize them in the night? Would a sudden squall drive them onto rocks? Would the overseer, in a fit of pique, single him out for an especially brutal beating? Would this persistent cough turn into something that laid him low permanently? This undercurrent of fear frayed the nerves and soured any potential for peace. Row, pole, haul, bail, eat, badly, sleep, poorly, repeat. The sheer, stupefying monotony of his existence was a potent psychological toxin. The scenery along the Nile, while majestic to a tourist, became a blur of sameness to the man who toiled upon it day after day, year after year. His tasks were repetitive, demanding little thought but immense physical effort, grinding down any spark of intellectual curiosity or creativity. Each day was a near identical copy of the last, stretching into a future that promised only more of the same. This predictability, devoid of positive anticipation, could lead to a profound sense of hopelessness, a feeling that he was trapped in an endless, meaningless cycle. He was, in the grand scheme of the Egyptian state or a noble's estate, an expendable resource, a unit of labor, less valuable than the cargo he transported or the boat he propelled. He had little to no control over his work, his schedule, his rations, or his physical well-being. He was ordered, driven, punished, and largely ignored as a human being with his own thoughts, feelings, or aspirations, if he even dared to have any. This constant reinforcement of his insignificance, his utter lack of agency, could foster a deep-seated resentment, a bitter cynicism, or a complete shutdown of emotional expression, a kind of internal exile. Even when surrounded by dozens of other men on a large barge, true camaraderie might have been a rare commodity. Shared suffering could create bonds. Yes, often expressed through grim, sarcastic humor or small, unspoken acts of mutual support. But the brutal competition for meager resources, the fear of the overseer's informants, and the sheer exhaustion that left little energy for social niceties could also breed suspicion, irritability, and a sense of profound isolation. Everyone was in their own private hell, just trying to survive the day. What happened to the youthful hopes or dreams he might once have harbored? They were likely ground into dust by the relentless mill of his daily life. Joy was a fleeting, suspicious visitor. His emotional landscape probably narrowed to a few hardy perennials, stoic resignation, fatalism. What will be, and it probably won't be good. Flashes of impotent rage that had to be quickly suppressed, and perhaps a grim satisfaction in simply having survived another day. Coping mechanisms were few and far between. Perhaps a furtive swig of rough beer, if they were transporting it, and the opportunity for pilfering arose, a risky business. Maybe the occasional shared story or song during the brief evening respite, a momentary escape into myth or legend, or perhaps just a retreat into the deepest recesses of his own mind, a shutting down of feeling as a means of self-preservation. Witnessing the frequent accidents, injuries, and deaths of his comrades would only reinforce this bleak outlook, a constant memento mori in a life already steeped in hardship. The mental toll was insidious, a slow poisoning of the spirit that left him weary not just in body, but in soul. He was a survivor, yes, but survival at what cost? If our boatman ever entertained the naive notion that the crocodiles, hippos, scorching sun, and treacherous currents were the sum total of his daily antagonists. He was quickly disabused of this fantasy the moment another human being entered his immediate vicinity. For while the natural world was an indifferent engine of hardship, his fellow men, particularly those a notch or two higher on the social food chain, often seemed to actively relish their role in making his existence just that little bit more unbearable, and even those who shared his ore-blistered plight weren't always a comforting presence. The individuals who owned the cargo, chartered the boat, or were otherwise in a position to dictate the terms of our boatman's suffering, formed a delightful rogues' gallery of petty tyrants, nervous wrecks, and officious little demigods. Looming largest in his daily consciousness was, of course, the overseer or boat captain. Often interchangeable roles, always interchangeable sources of dread. This was the man whose job it was to translate the abstract concept of profit, or Pharaoh's will, into the concrete reality of your aching muscles and shattered spirit. His qualifications usually included a pair of lungs capable of producing insults that could strip paint from a royal barge at 50 paces, an encyclopedic knowledge of your perceived shortcomings, and an arm that never seemed to tire of wielding his chosen instrument of motivation, be it a cured hippopotamus hide whip that sang a nasty little song before it bit, a sturdy acacia rod that left impressive lasting welts, or simply a well-aimed gob of spittle to punctuate a particularly cutting remark. He was the first voice you heard in the pre-dawn gloom, a gravelly bark that could wake the dead, or at least make them wish they were, and often the last image you saw before collapsing, his silhouette against the dying embers of a fire, perhaps, still muttering about the day's inefficiencies. He saw sloth in every pause for breath, insolence in every weary glance, and deliberate sabotage in every accident. His praise was non-existent. His criticism, a constant flowing river of inventive invective. "Move, you snail-paced sons of diseased baboons," he might roar, as you strained to push a multi-ton barge off a sandbank. Is that an oar you're holding, or are you merely trying to tickle the river into submission? His creativity and abuse was perhaps the only truly impressive thing about him. He was the human embodiment of the Nile's caprice, sometimes a roaring cataract of fury, sometimes a sullen, brooding swamp of disapproval, but never, ever a gentle, supportive current. If your cargo was commercial, grain, wine, oil, pottery, livestock, what have you, you'd often have the pleasure of the merchant himself, or his equally agitated representative, along for the ride. This individual, usually soft from a life spent counting copper deben rather than hauling them, viewed the entire journey as a personal affront, orchestrated by malevolent deities and incompetent boatmen. He would hover on the edge of any activity, wringing his hands, his brow furrowed with the weight of potential lost profits. "Careful with those amphorae, you clumsy oafs," he'd shriek, as you manhandled his precious and probably overpriced wine jars, each one representing a tiny fraction of his fortune, but a significant portion of your daily terror of breakage. Every delay, a contrary wind, a shallow patch, a necessary repair to your sieve-like boat, was, in his eyes, a deliberate conspiracy. "We'll be ruined. Ruined," he'd wail, clutching his head as if personally struck by Osiris. He'd question your speed, your navigation, your ancestry, and your commitment to his financial well-being. He'd peer suspiciously at your meager rations, perhaps wondering if you were secretly feasting on his profits. His presence was a constant whining hum of anxiety, a human mosquito whose buzz was almost as irritating as the real thing. Transporting goods or personnel for a noble or high official brought its own special flavor of human interaction. The noble himself would rarely deign to travel on anything less than a palatial canopied vessel crewed by his own liveried and probably equally miserable servants. But his agent, his proxy, was often on board your humble craft to ensure his master's interests were impeccably served. This individual, puffed up with borrowed importance, usually treated you and your fellow boatmen as a particularly noisome form of talking mildew. He would issue commands with an air of weary condescension, as if addressing particularly dim-witted pack animals. He'd wrinkle his nose at the smells of your honest, if pungent labor, make pointed remarks about the state of your vessel, as if you had any say in its upkeep, and demand a level of service and deference utterly mismatched to your station or his actual authority. He expected the choicest, i.e., least awful spot on the boat, the cleanest water, a relative term, and for you to somehow intuit his needs before he even voiced them. His displeasure, if incurred, could have serious repercussions, as a word from him to his master could see you flogged, fined, or simply disappeared from the river's roster. Perhaps the most unnerving of all was the scribe. Whether employed by the state to tally grain for temple storehouses, or by a merchant to inventory his goods, the scribe was a figure of quiet, ominous power. He'd sit apart, often on a folding stool under a small awning you'd have gladly sold a kidney for, with his palette, brushes, and papyrus scroll. His lips would move as he counted, his reed pen scratching away, documenting every sack, every jar, every miserable cow. He rarely spoke to you directly, unless it was to point out a discrepancy, a damaged item, or a shortfall. His voice usually a dry, dispassionate monotone that somehow conveyed more condemnation than the overseer's loudest bellows. His silence was judgmental. His gaze, as it swept over the toiling boatman, was assessing, calculating, and utterly devoid of empathy. He represented the implacable bureaucratic machinery of Egypt, a system that saw you not as a man, but as a number, a unit of transport, a potential source of error in its grand ordered calculations. A flick of his pen could mean a docking of your already pathetic rations, or an accusation of theft that could lead to dire consequences. He was the embodiment of scrutiny, and under his watchful eye, every bead of sweat felt like an admission of guilt. In the grand cosmic balance of effort and reward, the Nile boatman occupied a distinctly unprofitable niche. The sheer amount of physical labor, skill, yes, navigating that treacherous river with a leaky boat was a skill, however, unacknowledged. And endurance he expended daily was monumental. The appreciation he received for it was, to put it mildly, microscopic. Did a relieved merchant clap him on the back and offer a bonus when his precious cargo of slightly bruised pomegranates finally reached its destination? Did a noble's agent commend his crew for battling a sudden squall and saving the master's prized hunting cheetahs from a watery grave? Did the overseer ever say, "Remarkable effort today, lads. Extra bread all round, and take the afternoon off"? The very notion is laughable enough to make a sphinx crack a smile. Competence was simply the expected baseline. You did your job, you didn't sink the boat, you didn't lose the cargo, you didn't die. That was the minimum requirement for continued, unacknowledged existence. Your reward was not praise, but the absence of immediate punishment. Your bonus was not an extra deben of copper, but the permission to wake up the next day and do it all over again. The immense infrastructure of Egypt, its temples, its palaces, its armies, its very agricultural wealth, floated on the aching backs of men like you. Yet you were as invisible to the beneficiaries as the individual drops of water that made up the Nile. They saw the grain, the stone, the wine. They rarely, if ever, saw the blood, sweat, and ground-down humanity that moved it. If your efforts were noticed at all, it was usually only when something went spectacularly wrong. Then suddenly you became very visible indeed, usually as the focal point of someone else's rage, and the recipient of swift, often brutal justice. Gratitude was a luxury you couldn't afford, and one that was never offered. Your daily companions in this floating inferno were your fellow boatmen, a motley assembly of souls as battered and weary as yourself. Relationships within this group were a complex tapestry, woven from shared hardship, individual desperation, and the ever-present shadow of authority. There were moments, undoubtedly, of a rough, unspoken solidarity, when you're all enduring the same scorching sun, the same aching muscles, the same vile rations, and the same overseer's lash, a certain bond can form. It might manifest in a shared, under-the-breath curse when a particularly idiotic order was given. It might be the silent passing of a waterskin to a mate on the verge of heatstroke, or a quick, almost imperceptible warning nudge if someone was about to step on a loose plank or into the path of a swinging boom. Laughter, when it occurred, was a harsh, barking caw of men who found a perverse humor in the sheer absurdity of their plight. A man slipping spectacularly in a patch of donkey dung, another getting a face full of muddy water from a poorly timed oar splash, the overseer tripping over his own feet. These were the moments that might elicit a brief, grim chuckle, a momentary flash of shared amusement in the vast ocean of misery. It was the humor of the condemned, a way of acknowledging the suckage without succumbing to it entirely. But the relentlessly brutal conditions could just as easily erode any sense of brotherhood. When rations were scarce, a missing crust of bread could transform a fellow sufferer into a suspected thief, leading to furtive glares, whispered accusations, and sometimes swift, brutal fights in the cramped darkness of the sleeping quarters. When the overseer was looking for someone to blame for a delay, the instinct for self-preservation could override any nascent loyalty. With fingers subtly pointed and convenient scapegoats offered up, there was an unspoken pecking order. The older, more hardened veterans, those who had somehow managed to survive years of this abuse, often claimed the slightly less punishing rowing positions, the spot nearest the meager cooking fire, or the first, and therefore slightly larger, ladleful from the communal pot of questionable stew. Newcomers, the young and unseasoned, were often at the bottom, given the worst tasks, the leakiest part of the boat to sleep in, and the brunt of both the elements and the casual cruelties of their more experienced comrades, who perhaps saw in them a reminder of their own lost youth and vigor. Amongst this, there likely existed an unwritten code of conduct, a set of rules for surviving each other as much as the river. Don't shirk your share of the work too obviously, or you'd feel the resentment of your exhausted peers. Don't complain too loudly, or you'd attract the wrong kind of attention for everyone. Share what little you had if you could spare it, because tomorrow you might be the one in desperate need. And perhaps most importantly, what happened on the boat stayed on the boat. The petty squabbles, the minor acts of defiance, the shared moments of black humor. These were the secrets of a fraternity bound by misery, not to be shared with outsiders, especially not those in authority. Ultimately, your fellow boatmen were both your closest allies and potential rivals, your confidants in suffering, and your competitors for survival. They were the only ones who truly understood the depth of your daily grind, the constant aches, the pervasive fears. They were the mirrors reflecting your own exhaustion and despair, and sometimes, in a fleeting moment of shared humanity, the only comfort to be found in a world largely devoid of it. But always, the demands of the river and the masters came first, and any bond was, by necessity, as fragile as an old fishing net. Having endured the back-breaking labor, the malevolent environment, the treacherous tools, the assaults on his physical and mental well-being, and the often vexing company of his fellow humans, our ancient Egyptian Nile boatman might have reasonably hoped for some small solace in the basic necessities of life. He would have been, as was customary, cruelly disappointed. The luxuries of food, shelter, and rest in his world were less about comfort and replenishment, and more about redefining the absolute bare minimum required to prevent a human being from simply ceasing to function altogether. And even that was a close-run thing. Dining aboard your typical Nile cargo vessel, or on the banks during a mooring, was an experience that would make a vulture pause and reconsider its life choices. It was less a culinary art and more a daily exercise in consuming just enough calories of dubious quality and alarming texture to fuel the next round of torment. The absolute, unshakable cornerstone of this gastronomical wasteland was bread. But banish from your mind any visions of warm, fragrant, fluffy loaves. This was boatman's bread, a different beast entirely. Usually fashioned from coarse barley or emmer wheat, ground with stone querns that generously contributed a fine dusting of rock particles to every batch, adding a delightful, tooth-grinding crunch. It was baked in bulk, perhaps once a week if the schedule allowed such extravagance. By the time it reached you, it was often as hard as a sun-baked mud brick, with a dense, chewy interior that tasted faintly of despair and old sacks. Its primary virtue was its durability. You could probably use a loaf to patch a small hole in the hull in a pinch. You'd gnaw on it, your jaw aching, your teeth complaining, trying to moisten it with saliva, or if available, a sip of the river's finest. Sometimes it would be enlivened by weevils, adding a tiny, unexpected protein boost, though most preferred their baked goods unwiggling. To accompany this regal fare, you usually had onions, raw, pungent, tear-inducing onions, sometimes garlic, equally assertive. These were the robust, no-nonsense flavorings of the working poor, easy to grow, easy to transport, and possessed of a certain olfactory power that could effectively ward off any close conversation, which, given your general state of hygiene, might have been a blessing. They were eaten with a gusto born not of Epicurean delight, but of a body craving any form of sustenance. You might also get a handful of lentils or beans, boiled into a bland, indeterminate mush, if the provisions were feeling particularly generous. Meat was a legend, a tale told by old boatmen to wide-eyed boys, usually involving a stolen goat or a particularly dim-witted pelican. Your primary hope for protein came from the Nile itself, in the form of fish. If the crew cast nets, or if part of the cargo included dried or salted fish, a common commodity, you might receive a small portion. Dried fish had the texture of ancient sandal leather and a saltiness that could mummify your tongue, but it was undeniably flavorful in a slapped across the face by a dead fish sort of way. Fresh fish, if caught and cooked on a makeshift fire, was a rare treat, though often hastily gutted and charred, its delicate flesh infused with the taste of wood smoke and desperation. Of course, any fish also came with the bonus of numerous tiny sharp bones, perfect for lodging in your throat at the most inconvenient moments. And to wash all this down? The ever-bountiful, ever-surprising Nile. You dipped your cup, a pottery shard, a hollowed gourd, or your cupped, filthy hands, directly into the river. The water's clarity and contents varied daily. Sometimes it was thick and brown with silt from upstream, giving it a certain earthy body and a gritty texture. Other times it was clearer, allowing you to better appreciate the various bits of flotsam, vegetation, and unidentified swimming things that it contained. It was, of course, teeming with bacteria, parasites, hello again, schistosomiasis, and the general runoff from every village, animal wallow, and papyrus swamp between Nubia and the Delta. It quenched your immediate thirst while simultaneously planting the seeds of your next intestinal rebellion. Dehydration was a constant enemy, so you drank, and hoped your internal constitution was up to the challenge of whatever microscopic zoo you'd just ingested. Sometimes, particularly if engaged on a state project or a longer voyage, a ration of beer might be provided. This wasn't the strong celebratory brew of festivals. Oh no. This was laborer's beer. Thin, watery, often sour, with a low alcohol content that provided more psychological comfort, the idea of beer, than actual intoxication or significant caloric intake. It was probably safer to drink than raw river water, at least as the brewing process might have killed off some of the more ambitious microbes. But it was hardly a morale booster, more like a slightly fermented, yeasty sigh in a cup. This fuel, consumed hastily, often while still working or perched precariously on some uncomfortable part of the boat, was a cruel joke compared to the monumental energy expended daily. You were in a constant state of caloric deficit, your body cannibalizing its own muscle to keep going. Your hunger, a dull, persistent ache that no amount of gritty bread and raw onions could ever truly satisfy. When the day's torment finally subsided with the setting sun, the question of where to lay your weary, aching body arose. The answer was rarely conducive to what a civilized person might call rest. If you slept on the boat, as was common, your bed was usually the deck itself. This offered a variety of tactile experiences, none of them pleasant. Rough-hewn wooden planks, liberally seasoned with splinters eager to embed themselves in your flesh, were the norm. These planks would be baking hot from the day's sun, slowly radiating heat upwards long into the night, or surprisingly cold and damp from dew or bilge water seepage. You'd search for a spot that was marginally flatter, slightly less likely to be a main thoroughfare for rats, who were your permanent, uninvited roommates, and perhaps not directly under a persistently dripping leak from the deck above, if there was one. A thin, often tattered reed mat might be your sole concession to comfort, if you were fortunate enough to own one or if it was provided. This did little to cushion the unyielding hardness of the deck, but did perhaps offer a slight barrier against the worst of the grime and some of the more adventurous insects. You'd curl up, using your bundled loincloth or a coil of rope as a pillow, limbs aching, skin itching, every muscle protesting. Privacy was a concept best left to pharaohs and high priests. You slept in close proximity to your fellow boatmen, a huddled mass of exhausted humanity. This brought with it its own unique soundscape, a chorus of snores ranging from gentle rumbles to full-throated hippo-like bellows, coughs that rattled the very timbers of the boat, groans and mutters as men thrashed in their troubled sleep, and the distinct rhythmic scratching that indicated someone nearby was engaged in a losing battle with fleas or lice. The collective aroma, a rich blend of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, bilge water, and lingering food smells, was something you learned to tolerate, if not exactly appreciate. If the boat was moored for the night, especially on a longer journey or near a settlement, you might sleep ashore. This sometimes meant the relative luxury of a temporary, hastily erected shelter of reeds or palm fronds, a tukul. While offering some respite from the wind and dew, these structures were often just as cramped, bug-infested, and lacking in comfort as the boat deck. The ground beneath was still hard, and you were now more accessible to land-based pests like scorpions, snakes, or the jackals, whose mournful, eerie howls would often provide your evening serenade, a charming reminder of the wildness lurking just beyond the firelight, if you were lucky enough to have a fire. Hygiene in these shelters, whether afloat or ashore, was a distant dream. Ablutions, if performed at all, were a quick splash of Nile water on the face and hands. Latrine facilities were usually that bit of the riverbank over there, or the lee side of the boat. The accumulation of filth was simply another layer of your daily reality. The idea that night was a time for 8 hours of peaceful, uninterrupted slumber would have been hilariously alien to our boatman. His rest was as fragmented and unreliable as his oldest tow rope. Someone always had to be awake. Even a moored boat was vulnerable. River pirates, though not an everyday occurrence, were a genuine threat, particularly in more remote stretches, or if the cargo was known to be valuable. Crocodiles and hippos didn't keep to a strict diurnal schedule, and mooring ropes had a nasty habit of chafing through or slipping their moorings, especially if the river level was changing or a strong wind picked up. So, watches were set. If it was your turn, you'd spend a few miserable hours squinting into the darkness, every rustle in the reeds, every splash in the water, every creak of the boat setting your nerves on edge, fighting off the crushing desire to simply keel over and sleep where you stood. Many Nile boats, especially the older cargo barges, leaked with the enthusiasm of a gossip sharing a juicy secret. This didn't stop just because the sun went down. Bailing duties often continued in shifts throughout the night. Just as you drifted off into a shallow, uneasy doze, a rough shake or a kick would rouse you for your turn to scoop, lift, and dump the ever-encroaching river, the rhythmic slosh thump, a grim lullaby for those trying to sleep nearby. Even if you weren't on watch or bailing, true rest was elusive. The throbbing ache in your back, the fire in your rope-burned hands, the maddening itch of 100 insect bites, the gnawing emptiness in your stomach, the chill of the night air seeping into your bones, or the stifling heat radiating from the deck on a summer night. Your own body was often your worst enemy when it came to sleep. You'd toss and turn on the hard surface, trying to find a position that didn't put agonizing pressure on some bruised or strained part of your anatomy. A futile quest for comfort. As mentioned, your sleeping companions were rarely a silent bunch. Snoring, coughing, teeth grinding, sleep talking, often involving curses or pleas to various deities. The furtive rustlings of someone trying to find a more comfortable spot or scratch an itch without waking everyone else. It all contributed to a nocturnal environment that was anything but restful. Add to this the boat's own groans and creaks as it shifted on the water, the slap of waves, the distant cries of animals, and the ever-present hum of insects, and you had a recipe for chronic sleep deprivation. The cumulative effect of this was devastating. Our boatman likely lived in a perpetual state of near exhaustion, his mind clouded by fatigue, his reflexes dulled, his patience worn paper thin. This lack of proper rest didn't just make the next day's labor harder. It compromised his immune system, made him more susceptible to accidents, and slowly ground away at his mental resilience. Sleep wasn't a luxury. It was a battle, and one he rarely won. After a lifetime spent wrestling with capricious tools, a rebellious body, a frequently hostile environment, and an assortment of equally challenging human beings, one might reasonably expect our ancient Egyptian Nile boatmen to at least be compensated in a manner that acknowledged his pivotal role in the grand theater of Egyptian life. Such an expectation, however, would be as woefully misplaced as hoping for a cool breeze during a Khamsin wind. The economic realities of his existence were less about fair exchange for labor, and more about a carefully calibrated system designed to extract maximum effort for minimum outlay, ensuring he remained just alive enough to continue being useful, but never comfortable enough to entertain dangerous notions like dignity or a savings plan. The concept of a salary or a regular wage paid in clinking copper divan or silver shat was for the common Nile boatman largely the stuff of myth and legend. Tales whispered about skilled artisans in the royal workshops at Deir el-Medina or the high-ranking priests in their opulent temple complexes. His remuneration, when it arrived, was typically far more tangible, far less fungible, and almost always disappointing. It was a direct transaction, your sweat and suffering in exchange for the bare necessities to produce more sweat and suffering tomorrow. Payment, in the glorious, highly organized bureaucracy of ancient Egypt, usually took the form of rations. This wasn't a company perks situation. This was survival, itemized. The core of this package was grain, barley or emmer wheat, doled out in measures that were supposed to sustain a working man. Alongside this, if the quartermaster was feeling benevolent or the stores were particularly full, might come a small allotment of sesame or castor oil, useful for lamps or for making your already leathery skin slightly more leathery, a length of coarse linen cloth from which you could fashion another thrilling loincloth when your current one finally disintegrated into its constituent atoms, and on special occasions or as part of a standard work contract for state projects, a ration of beer. This beer, as previously maligned, was usually a thin, cloudy, and somewhat sour brew, more a symbolic nod to refreshment than a genuine source of either pleasure or significant caloric intake. It did, however, likely contain fewer active parasites than raw river water, so it had that going for it. Sometimes, particularly if working on fishing vessels or if fish was part of the cargo being transported from the Fayum or the Delta, dried or salted fish would supplement the grain. Onions and garlic, those pungent staples, were often included, providing a welcome, if socially isolating, burst of flavor. But that was generally the extent of the feast. Fresh fruits, honeyed cakes, roasted meats. These were the stuff of tomb paintings depicting idealized afterlives, not the contents of a boatman's daily breadbasket. Was this ration delivered with punctuality and precision? You jest, surely. The consistency of your pay was as reliable as a drunken navigator in a whirlpool. If the inundation had been good and the harvest bountiful, the Pharaoh's granaries, and by extension, the lesser granaries that supplied work crews, would be overflowing. In such times, your measure of grain might be full, even generous by its usual Spartan standards. But a poor flood meant a meager harvest, and a meager harvest meant that everyone down the line felt the pinch. Your ration would shrink, the quality would decline, more grit, more chaff, more weevils per measure, and the gnawing emptiness in your belly would become a more constant companion. Furthermore, the efficiency and honesty of the local scribes and overseers played a significant role. A spillage here, a miscalculation there, a sudden infestation in the stores, all could lead to your expected ration being inexplicably lighter. Complaining was, of course, an excellent way to discover new and exciting forms of corporal punishment, or to find yourself suddenly assigned to the leakiest part of the boat. And just when you thought your income couldn't get any more depressing, there were the deductions. This was where the true creativity of your employers shone. Snapped an oar through sheer exhaustion and a hidden flaw in the wood. The cost of its replacement, or a punitive fine, might be deducted from your grain allowance. Was a pottery jar in the cargo found cracked upon arrival, even though it was probably packed by a half-blind apprentice in a fit of pique? Prepare to see your fish ration swim away. Were you deemed to be working at a pace more suited to a meditative snail than a productive boatman? That perceived sloth could easily translate into a smaller loaf of bread. The boat itself required constant minor repairs. Pitch for the seams, new lashings for the reeds. While major repairs were the owner's concern, the cost of everyday upkeep materials could sometimes be subtly siphoned from the collective rations of the crew. It was a system designed to ensure that you never, ever got ahead, and that any minor misfortune, whether your fault or not, would be felt directly in your stomach. The grand, soul-crushing irony of our boatman's economic situation was the chasm between the monumental importance of his labor and the almost insulting pittance he received in return. He was an essential cog in the mighty engine of the Egyptian state and economy, yet he was treated with the consideration one might afford a slightly troublesome piece of driftwood. Think about it. Without men like him, the pyramids would have remained unbuilt, their colossal stones languishing in distant quarries. The temples would have stood empty, their altars bare, their priests unfed, as the offerings of grain and livestock failed to arrive from the fertile estates. The armies of Pharaoh would have marched on empty stomachs, their supply lines cut, their ability to project power and defend the Black Land crippled. The vibrant trade that flowed up and down the Nile, exchanging goods from Nubia to the Mediterranean, would have dwindled to a trickle. He and his brethren were the hauliers of empire, the sinews that bound the two lands together, the tireless transporters of its sustenance, its symbols, and its strength. Every magnificent tomb, every towering obelisk, every bustling marketplace, every loaf of bread eaten by a scribe or a soldier, owed its existence, in part, to the sweat and toil of men like him. For this pivotal contribution to one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations, his reward was a life lived on the absolute margins of society. His social status was a notch above a slave, perhaps, but well below that of even a humble peasant farmer, who at least had a theoretical claim to the produce of his own small plot, before taxes, of course. He was often viewed as rough, itinerant, and untrustworthy, a necessary evil to be endured by those who required his services. He moved mountains of gold in the form of grain, which was gold to a hungry populace, yet he himself would likely never see a single deben of actual gold, unless it was part of a heavily guarded cargo he was forbidden to touch. He ensured the granaries were full enough to withstand years of famine, yet his own family might be acutely familiar with the pangs of hunger. This wasn't merely an oversight, it was systemic. Laborers were plentiful and therefore cheap. Their individual lives were of little consequence to the grandees who benefited from their collective effort. They were, in essence, a renewable resource, like the Nile reeds themselves, easily harvested, easily replaced when worn out. The concept that the man straining at the oar, risking his life daily, deserved a share of the wealth he was creating would have been as alien as the idea of the sun rising in the west. Our boatman's already precarious economic tightrope walk could be made even more treacherous by events far beyond his control, the grand currents of state policy and divine misfortune. The annual Nile flood, the Akhet, was the engine of Egypt's agricultural wealth. A good inundation, depositing a rich layer of fertile silt across the fields, meant a bountiful harvest. For the boatman, this translated into an immense volume of grain, flax, and other produce needing transport from the fields to the regional storehouses, then to the major cities and temple estates. The workload would be immense, the days even longer, the demands even more pressing. His rations might be marginally more secure during such times of plenty, but the intensity of labor would be dialed up to 11. Conversely, a series of low floods meant agricultural disaster, shrunken harvests, widespread hunger, and economic stagnation. For the boatman, this could mean less work available, fiercer competition for spots on any crew, and drastically reduced rations as the entire land tightened its belt. Paradoxically, even in famine, some transport was needed, perhaps moving emergency supplies, or officials assessing the damage. But the pay would be even worse, the desperation even greater. When a pharaoh, bless his divine ambition, decided to embark on a major building project, a new pyramid complex, a magnificent addition to Karnak, a colossal statue of himself to awe future generations, this was often terrible news for the common laborer, including the boatman. Such projects required staggering quantities of materials, millions of tons of limestone and granite quarried hundreds of miles away, massive timbers for scaffolding and ramps, often imported from Lebanon at great expense, countless jars of water for the workers. All this had to be moved, and the Nile was the only highway. Boatmen would be conscripted in vast numbers, their lives and vessels pressed into state service. The conditions on these projects were notoriously brutal, overseen by royal taskmasters with little patience for human frailty. The cargo was heavier, the deadlines tighter, the punishments for failure swifter. While the state might provide basic rations, the work was often far more dangerous and grueling than regular commercial hauling. You weren't just moving grain. You were moving mountains, ensuring Pharaoh's eternal glory, one aching muscle and shattered hope at a time, all for the same, or worse, compensation. Egypt, despite its periods of splendid isolation, was no stranger to warfare, whether repelling invaders from Libya or Kush, or embarking on its own imperial adventures into Syria-Palestine. During such times, the humble Nile boatman became a vital cog in the military machine. His boat might be commandeered to transport soldiers, weapons, chariots, horses, and supplies to the front lines or along strategic river routes. This was, needless to say, a significant upgrade in the danger department. You were now not only battling currents and crocodiles, but also potentially enemy archers on the riverbanks or hostile naval patrols. Your cargo might be less prone to spoiling than grain, but it was considerably more likely to explode if carrying, say, flammable materials for siege engines, or try to kill you if carrying grumpy, heavily armed soldiers. Rations might be prioritized for the fighting men, leaving you with the dregs. And if your boat was sunk or captured, your chances of making it back to your favorite mudbank were slim. Internal unrest, civil strife, or periods of weak central authority could also disrupt regular trade, making work scarce and dangerous, with bandits and renegade local lords adding yet another layer of peril to your already challenging profession. In essence, The boatman's economic life was one of constant insecurity, meager returns, and utter dependence on forces far greater than himself. He toiled at the very foundation of a magnificent civilization, yet his share of its splendor was the dust under its chariot wheels. If there was one defining characteristic of our ancient Egyptian Nile boatman's life, beyond the constant physical agony and the parade of unpleasant companions, it was its sheer, soul-pulverizing endlessness. There was no project completion bonus, no end-of-season layoff, no retirement party, with slightly stale honey cakes. There was only the river, the boat, the cargo, and the horizon, a horizon that, no matter how far you rowed, poled, or towed, always seemed to promise nothing more than another stretch of river, another boat, and another back-breaking cargo. The concept of finishing a task was a cruel illusion, a mirage shimmering on the heat-baked mudflats of his daily existence. You might, after weeks of straining muscle and sinew, finally deliver that mountain of grain to the temple granaries at Karnak. A sense of relief? Perhaps, for a fleeting microsecond, like the brief coolness after a splash of bilge water on a scorching day. But before the dust of your arrival had even settled, before the ache in your shoulders had a chance to subside from agony to mere torture, a new imperative would arise. The overseer, his voice a gravelly rasp of fresh demands, would be there, pointing towards a new pile of something. Perhaps blocks of sandstone from Gebel el Silsila, destined for some noble's vanity tomb, or 1,000 jars of pungent natron from Wadi el Natron needed for the mummification workshops, or even just a load of empty pottery to be taken back downriver to be filled with something else equally heavy and awkward. Finished was simply the brief, breathless pause between one form of torment and the next. If you weren't actively hauling cargo, you were mending the eternally decaying boat, smearing pitch and Nile mud into its protesting seams, replacing a rotten plank that threatened to give your vessel an unwanted skylight at waterline level, or re-whipping a rope that was shedding fibers like a molting ibis. If the boat was miraculously sound, a rare and suspicious state of affairs, then there were oars to be scraped free of splinters, a task that usually just created new, more aggressive splinters, sails to be patched with clumsy stitches, or bilge water to be bailed. An activity so constant it felt less like a chore and more like a bodily function of the boat itself. The journey itself was a microcosm of this endlessness. Each league of the river, hard won, simply revealed another league, identical in its demands, its dangers, its monotony. Each bend you rounded with a groan of effort simply presented another straight stretch of water glaring back at you under the indifferent sun. There was no grand finale, no victory parade. There was only the next task, the next load, the next mile, the next ache. Your life was a scroll unrolling endlessly, its hieroglyphs spelling out the same repetitive litany of toil, hunger, and discomfort, day after weary day. This relentless cycle was not accidental. It was woven into the very fabric of Egyptian life, as intrinsic as the Nile itself. Your existence was umbilically linked to the grand agricultural clock of the two lands, a rhythm that brooked no argument and offered no escape. When the sacred Nile swelled in its annual flood, turning the cultivated lands into a vast, shallow lake, it wasn't a signal for a well-earned vacation. For the boatman, it meant a shift in the nature of his suffering. Main river traffic for heavy cargo might slow, but demand for smaller skiffs and shallow draft vessels to navigate the inundated fields, to connect villages suddenly turned into islands, to rescue stranded livestock or people, or to transport officials surveying the flood's extent, would surge. It was a time of murky waters, hidden obstacles, and the charming possibility of your boat being swept away by unexpected currents or grounding on a submerged village wall. You weren't idle, you were just differently miserable, probably wetter, and with an increased chance of encountering an irate, displaced crocodile. As the waters receded, leaving behind their gift of life-giving black silt, the land re-emerged, and so did a fresh wave of demands for your services. Seeds needed to be transported to the newly exposed fields, tools and plows, and the oxen to pull them, another delightful cargo, ferried to remote farming communities, and surveyors and scribes moved from plot to plot to ensure Pharaoh got his due. The canals, now lower, would need careful navigation. The mudbanks would be soft and treacherous, and the sun would begin to reclaim its dominion with renewed ferocity. The land was coming alive, and your job was to serve its rebirth, usually by hauling something heavy related to it. And then came Shemu, the harvest season, the culmination of Egypt's agricultural year, and for you, the absolute peak of organized agony. This was when the true mountains of grain, barley, emmer wheat, along with flax, dates, figs, and other produce, had to be moved, and moved now. From the fields to local threshing floors, from threshing floors to village granaries, from village granaries to regional administrative centers, and from there to the colossal temple estates and royal storehouses in the major cities. It was a frantic, non-stop operation. Boats like yours would be loaded to the gunwales, sometimes dangerously so. The pressure to move as much as possible, as quickly as possible, immense. You'd work from before dawn until long after dusk, fueled by desperation and the overseer's whip, every muscle screaming, every nerve frayed. The dust from the grain would fill your lungs, the chaff would get in your eyes, and the sheer, unending volume of it all would threaten to drown you in a golden sea of someone else's prosperity. This wasn't just a job. It was a life sentence dictated by the river's pulse. You were as much a part of this natural cycle as the sprouting seed or the migrating bird, but with considerably less freedom and far worse accommodations. To imagine a life outside this relentless wheel, a life of rest, of choice, of comfort, was a dangerous exercise in futility, a fleeting dream that would only make the waking reality of the oar in your hand and the ache in your back more bitter. It would be an insult to suggest that our boatman's life contained anything approaching joy in the modern or even ancient noble sense. Happiness was a foreign country whose borders he would never cross. Yet, even in the deepest, darkest pit of daily misery, the human spirit, that stubborn, resilient weed, can sometimes find the tiniest, most improbable crack of light. These weren't moments of pleasure, but rather fleeting, almost imperceptible nods from the universe that, despite its best efforts, it hadn't quite managed to extinguish you entirely. There might have been a fleeting internal twitch of something akin to professional pride, a boatman's grim, calloused version of it anyway, when, against all odds, using a ridiculously oversized steering oar and the subtle shifts of your own exhausted body weight, you successfully navigated a particularly treacherous stretch of rapids, or brought your leaky, overloaded barge alongside a crowded quay without smashing into a dozen smaller, more fragile vessels. There was a certain grim satisfaction. Not joy, mind you, but the bitter acknowledgement that you, a miserable, underfed cog, had momentarily outwitted the malevolent forces of river and gravity. It was the pride of the survivor, the craftsman, who, with utterly inadequate tools, still managed to wrestle a semblance of order from chaos. Reaching a destination after a long and arduous leg of the journey did bring a certain undeniable relief. The physical act of stopping the primary mode of torment, be it rowing, poling, or towing, felt like a minor miracle. Your muscles would hum with a painful gratitude. This relief, however, was usually short-lived, as it immediately gave way to the next phase of torture. Unloading the cargo, which was often just as backbreaking as loading it, if not more so, as you were now significantly more exhausted. Still, that brief moment of, we made it, we didn't sink, no one important died, was a tangible if fleeting reward. Sometimes, amidst the grunts and groans, a shard of dark humor would surface. A perfectly timed, under-the-breath sarcastic comment about the overseer's new potbelly. A shared, eye-rolling acknowledgement of a particularly idiotic order, or a grimly funny observation about the edibility of the current batch of weevils in the bread. These could spark a brief, harsh bark of laughter amongst the crew. It wasn't mirth. It was a pressure valve, a way of saying, yes, this is all monumentally awful, but at least we can all see how monumentally awful it is together. This shared cynicism was a thin, but surprisingly resilient, thread of connection. Very rarely, if the overseer was distracted and the immediate demands of labor momentarily eased, you might catch a glimpse of something that wasn't actively trying to kill or exploit you. A spectacular sunrise painting the eastern cliffs in hues of rose and gold before the heat became unbearable. The silent, majestic flight of a flock of ibis against a turquoise sky. The brief, cool kiss of the pre-dawn breeze before the furnace of the day ignited. These moments offered no sustenance, no relief from toil, but they were fleeting reminders of a world beyond the grime and misery of the boat deck, a world that existed whether you were there to suffer in it or not. They were tiny, almost painful pinpricks of beauty in an otherwise ugly existence. These weren't compensations. They weren't silver linings. They were simply the faint, stubborn twitchings of a spirit not yet entirely crushed. Tiny proofs of resilience in the face of overwhelming, unending adversity. They were the fleas of joy, caught and briefly examined in a life thoroughly infested with the mange of hardship. The Nile, in its majestic indifference, witnessed countless generations of boatmen live, toil, and eventually fade, their individual lives as fleeting and unremarked as the ripples behind a passing skiff. For our boatman, the concept of a career arc was less a gentle curve towards a well-earned rest and more a slow, grinding descent into physical obsolescence, often accompanied by the bittersweet, mostly bitter task of inducting the next sacrificial lamb into the profession, frequently one of his own flesh and blood. If our boatman managed to survive long enough to procreate, and if the gods, or perhaps more accurately, the lack of effective contraception, blessed him with sons, then the question of their future was usually answered with a grim, unspoken certainty. In a society where trades were largely hereditary, and social mobility was about as common as a hippo gracefully executing a pirouette, his sons were, more often than not, destined to follow his blistered footsteps onto the swaying deck. You'd look at your boy, a scrawny lad perhaps, all knees and elbows, his eyes still holding a spark of youthful curiosity that the river hadn't yet managed to extinguish, and a cold knot would form in your belly. This wasn't the proud father envisioning his son taking over a thriving family business. This was a condemned man teaching his child the most efficient way to wear his own shackles. There was no grand speech about the noble tradition of river navigation, or the vital role of boatmen in the prosperity of the two lands. Your instruction was delivered in gruff commands, exasperated sighs, and the occasional well-aimed clout to the back of the head when his youthful ineptitude threatened to capsize the boat or earn you both a beating from the overseer. "Hold the tiller steady, you clumsy spawn of a Nile goose," you might bellow, your voice harsher than you intended, a cocktail of frustration, fear, and a strange, twisted form of love. Are you trying to offer us as a sacrifice to Sobek before we even reach the next bend? You'd teach him how to read the subtle lies of the water's surface, how to coil a rope so it didn't immediately become a cat's cradle of doom, how to use his meager weight to the best advantage when poling, how to bail with a rhythm that wouldn't exhaust him in the first hour, a skill that took years to master, or rather, to resign oneself to. Every lesson was a fresh stab of guilt. You were, quite literally, showing him the ropes of his own future misery. You were teaching him how to endure the pain, how to ignore the hunger, how to navigate the capricious tempers of men and gods, all so that he could one day be as broken and weary as you were. What a legacy. And the boy. He'd watch you, his father, this gnarled, sun-baked, often terrifying figure, with a mixture of emotions. Perhaps there was a flicker of youthful awe at your seemingly effortless strength, an illusion born of decades of practice and the absence of any alternative. Your uncanny ability to predict the river's moods, or the way you could unleash a torrent of curses so inventive they almost constituted poetry. But mostly there was fear. Fear of your temper. Fear of the river's dangers. Fear of the crushing labor he was now expected to perform. He'd see the older boatmen, their bodies twisted and scarred, their faces etched with a permanent weariness, and a cold dread would begin to settle in his young heart. This was his future. This was the pinnacle of his aspirations. His childhood games on the riverbank, once filled with innocent mimicry of boatmen's calls, would now be replaced by the grim reality of the work itself. The scent of mud and fish, once just a familiar background aroma, would become the perfume of his servitude. He might not have the words for it, but he'd feel the narrowing of horizons, the closing of unseen doors, as the river claimed him, just as it had claimed you. There was no malice in this passing of the torch. You weren't deliberately trying to ruin his life. You were, in the harsh calculus of survival, equipping him with the only skills you possessed, the only tools that might keep him from outright starvation, or being conscripted into something even worse, like hauling stones for a pyramid under the desert sun with no river breeze for even theoretical relief. It was a brutal form of love, a desperate act of provision in a world that offered few alternatives. You were teaching him to walk the same tightrope of misery you trod, because the only other option was to fall into the abyss. And so the cycle would continue, son after son, generation after generation, their lives as inexorably tied to the Nile's rhythm as the papyrus reeds growing on its banks. The river, that relentless moneylender, always collects its debts. And the currency it demanded from you was your strength, your vitality, your very sinew. For decades, your body had absorbed inhuman punishment, but even the toughest acacia plank eventually rots. That chronic cough, once a mere annoyance, now rattled your chest like dice in a cup, leaving you breathless after the smallest exertion. The arthritis in your hands made gripping an oar an exercise in pure, unadulterated agony. Your back, long a source of simmering resentment, now refused to straighten properly, locking you into a permanent apologetic stoop. You'd find yourself stumbling more often, your eyesight, clouded by years of sun glare, failing to spot the trip hazard until it was too late. The younger men, with their unthinking strength and cruel impatience, would start to outpace you, their grunts of effort a stark contrast to your wheezing gasps. The overseer's gaze, once sharp with demands for more work, would now pass over you with a new kind of assessment, the calculating look of a man evaluating a worn-out tool, wondering how many more uses he could squeeze from it before it shattered completely. There was no pension plan on the Nile, no sheltered accommodation for superannuated boat haulers. When you could no longer pull your oar, bail your share of the bilge, or lift your quota of cargo, you became redundant. A mouth to feed without the hands to earn it. A ghost haunting the riverbank, watching others now perform the dance of misery you knew so intimately. What then? There was no boatman's benevolent fund, no sheltered workshop for retired river dogs, no comfortable pension from the state you had served so faithfully, if invisibly. If you had surviving sons who were themselves boatmen, you might, if they were dutiful, or if your wife still held some sway, be allowed to linger on the periphery of their existence. A querulous, aching old man, huddled by their meager fire, perhaps occasionally mending a net with trembling arthritic fingers, a constant, visible reminder to them of their own grim future. More likely, if you had no family able or willing to support you, you became a beggar on the quayside. Your hand, once strong enough to pole a laden barge, now outstretched for a crust of bread or a rotten fig. Or you might simply crawl away to some anonymous spot on the riverbank, find a sliver of shade under an acacia tree, and wait for Osiris to finally call you to a reckoning, an afterlife where one desperately hoped there were no oars to pull, no cargo to haul, and the water was always, blessedly, still. Your legacy was not in monuments or inscriptions, but in the aching backs of your sons, and perhaps in a few well-worn paths along the tow lines, soon to be overgrown and forgotten, like your own unremarked life. And so, our ancient Egyptian Nile boatmen, having navigated a lifetime of currents both literal and metaphorical, the currents of the great river Hapi, the currents of relentless labor, the currents of societal indifference, and the currents of his own diminishing strength, eventually fades from our view, much as his own weary form would have eventually merged with the riverbanks he knew so intimately. He leaves behind no grand monuments in his name, no laudatory inscriptions, no treasure-filled tomb to ensure his comfortable passage into the Duat. His was a life writ in water, sweat, and silt. A story largely untold, yet one that underpins the very spectacle of the civilization we so often admire from a safe, comfortable distance. Pharaohs, their names echoing through millennia. Khufu, Hatshepsut, Rameses the Great, raised temples that clawed at the sky. Their visages carved in stone on a scale designed to awe gods and mortals alike. Priests in cool, incense-filled sanctuaries performed intricate rituals, their lives dedicated to maintaining Mayat and placating a pantheon of demanding deities. Generals, bedecked in leopard skins and the gold of valor, led armies forth to expand Egypt's glory or defend its sacred borders. Their stories are the headlines of history, their legacies preserved in papyrus and stone, their deeds sung by court poets. But beneath the towering obelisks, under the gilded thrones, within the very mortar of the temple walls, lies the anonymous, collective effort of countless individuals like our Nile boatman. He wore no Neem's crown, only a sweat-stained strip of linen. He wielded no Heka scepter, only a splintered oar. He issued no divine decrees, only perhaps a muttered curse at a stubborn current, or a recalcitrant donkey. His grand processions were not along sacred ways flanked by sphinxes, but along muddy towpaths, bent double under a coarse rope, or within the cramped, stinking confines of a cargo barge. Yet, without his unceasing, unglamorous toil, the pharaoh's granaries would have remained echoing voids. The stones for those magnificent temples would have stayed locked in their distant quarries. The incense for those sacred rituals would have never reached the altars, and the armies would have marched on empty stomachs, their chariots mired in logistical failure. He was the unseen foundation, the countless patient human pillars upon which the dazzling edifice of Egyptian power and piety was constructed. His importance was inversely proportional to his visibility, utterly crucial, entirely ignored. No statues were commissioned in his likeness, no stele erected to commemorate his decades of back-breaking service. If his name was ever scratched onto an ostracon for a work roster or a ration list, it has long since crumbled to dust, as ephemeral as the footprints he left on the riverbank, washed away by the next inundation. His individual story is lost, a single drop absorbed into the vast, flowing narrative of the Nile. Yet his collective legacy, the sum total of the efforts of all the Nile boatmen, who ever lived and toiled, is imprinted on the very soul of Egypt. It is there in every loaf of bread that sustained a scribe, an artisan, a farmer, a soldier, for 3,000 years. Bread made from grain that men like him hauled from field to granary to mill. It is there in the colossal stone blocks of the pyramids, each one a testament not only to architectural genius and royal ambition, but also to the sheer, brute force logistics of river transport, a feat accomplished by straining human muscle and enduring will. It is there in the vibrant frescoes of tombs, depicting scenes of plenty and trade, scenes made possible by the constant, reliable movement of goods along the watery spine of the kingdom. He and his brethren were the anonymous current, the tireless, circulatory system that allowed the culture, the economy, the religion, and the very statecraft of ancient Egypt to not just survive, but to flourish with such astonishing longevity and brilliance. They didn't just observe history from the sidelines. They were knee-deep in its making, physically propelling it forward, one grueling league, one agonizingly heavy load at a time. Their impact is not found in a king list, but in the quiet, persistent evidence of a civilization that knew how to move mountains, literally and figuratively, because it had men who could, and would, move anything upon its sacred river. So the next time you gaze in wonder at a golden death mask from Tutankhamun's tomb, or stand humbled before the silent, enigmatic Sphinx, or trace the intricate hieroglyphs on a temple wall recounting tales of gods and kings, spare a moment for the forgotten figure of the ancient Egyptian Nile boatman. He who lived a life of profound hardship, whose comforts were few, and whose burdens were many. He sought no glory and received none. Yet, in his unceasing labor, in his stubborn, almost superhuman endurance against odds that would crush a lesser spirit, or a better fed one with more options, he was far more than just a victim of his era, more than a mere beast of burden. He was an integral, indispensable component of the great unseen engine that powered one of history's most enduring and awe-inspiring civilizations. He was the grit in the system that somehow kept it from seizing, the strain in the tow rope that pulled against the inertia of impossibility, the aching, anonymous muscle that day after weary day, century after grinding century, turned the raw potential of a fertile river valley into a monumental testament to human endeavor. He wasn't just a passive observer swept along by the river of time. He was, in his own small, unacknowledged way, the river's very will to connect, to sustain, to build. He was the silent, enduring spark of human effort, often buried deep within the life-giving silt, a quiet, persistent heartbeat within the grand body of Hapi, keeping an empire not just afloat, but forging steadily onward into legend. His name is forgotten, his individual struggles unrecorded, but his collective contribution is eternal, as vast and as vital as the Nile itself.